sectarian tensions in some parts of Lebanon, some people are reluctant to accept displaced Shia communities because they're scared of being targeted by Israeli airstrikes. But not here.
We come to here, restaurant. We very happy in the restaurant. Restaurant is found all our need. We feel happy.
Livelihoods have been left behind and incomes lost. Meals delivered by charities help. Charles Hellu, the restaurant's owner, says everyone should feel at home.
1, 2, hey!
He was keen to show us what it's like here when there isn't war and mass displacement. He says Friday nights are special, but he says everyone from every village belongs to one community, and so now he must help.
Sure, I will close my business. Oh, well, where did people go? Can you tell me? Where? In the streets? No. All of us are human beings, so we need the peace.
Home is not far away, but it's not safe. Religions may differ between villages. There's death and destruction just down the road. But here, humanity prevails.
Dozens of beds line the floor of the dining room. People normally be eating meals. Each of the families has used bar stools to divide up their own space for a bit of privacy. Charles says he looks forward to when people are dancing on this floor once again. All of the families here say they want to go home. Everyone says they just want peace. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Sidon, Lebanon.
President Trump says the U.S. is close to making a deal with Iran. Speaking a short while ago, he also said the two countries have a very good relationship, but repeated that Tehran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon.
It's looking very good that we're going to make a deal with Iran, and it's going to be a good deal. It's going to be a deal with no nuclear weapons.
When is the next in-person round of negotiations on the war in Iran? When will
They're
that
all
take place?
important. I mean, it's not a question of around. All of them are
When will
important.
the next in-person
Probably,
meeting take
maybe
place?
over the weekend.
Okay, let's go back to Ali Hashem, who is in the Iranian capital. Ali, Trump is optimistic, apparently, about the negotiations that may be ongoing. He also says there's been some agreements on the nuclear program. Have you heard any confirmation of that from Iran?
Well, what we're hearing from here is more of cautious reception of this whole path because of also what the Iranians are describing as contradictory positions from the United States and attempts to sabotage from the Israelis. Now, the main issue I think the Iranians are having reservations on is the issue of the 20 years halt in enrichment, which the Americans offered on the table. And now the Iranians were preparing their response to it. However, President Trump, just in his last speech or interview, said that even the 20 years is not on the table and Iran should halt enrichment forever. And that's the only way he can make sure there's no nuclear bomb coming from Iran. So these are issues that the Iranians are having reservations on and are creating reasons for more and more mistrust. And they've been expressing this in different ways and on different occasions. However, today, the news of the ceasefire in Lebanon could, in a way or another, give some push for the attempts to resume negotiations. Yesterday's visit by the Pakistani delegation played a role in that, and probably in the coming few days, at least the coming 48 hours, will be crucial to know what's going to be next, whether Iran will be heading towards putting together with the United States a framework, not an agreement, not a comprehensive agreement, at least for now, a framework that could help negotiate the the most possible points to be negotiated.
Al Jazeera's Ali Hashem reporting live for us from Tehran. Thank you, Ali. Well, for more on the ceasefire in Lebanon, I'm joined by Alan Pincus. He's a former Israeli diplomat and joins us from Tel Aviv. Alan, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being with us. Prime Minister Benjamin
Riley.
Netanyahu says that this is an opportunity to forge a historic peace agreement with Lebanon. What does that look like?
He says a lot of things. I wouldn't take him at face value. He's saying this because he was coerced into this by President Trump. This is not a ceasefire that he wanted, and I'm not yet sure about the exact contours of the ceasefire. And I think one of your reporters correctly reported just a few moments ago that there is a Hezbollah kill zone in the south of Lebanon, and it's not at all clear that the ceasefire will include that area. And once a ceasefire becomes partial, it ceases to be a ceasefire. So I'm not sure about that. Now, as for his declaration of peace with Lebanon, look, we've been in this opera before. Back in the 80s, there was a peace agreement signed between Israel and Lebanon. And when Israel withdrew from South Lebanon in the year 2000, in May of 2000, there was again talk of a peace agreement, and again in 2006 after another round of war, and now we're doing this again. I think Mr. Netanyahu failed, and I'm not saying it's entirely his fault because I think it was unattainable to begin with. He failed in his stated objective of disarming Hezbollah and basically ridding Hezbollah as a military and political force. And I honestly cannot see any peace agreement being signed between Israel and Lebanon with Hezbollah still armed. And for that matter, I don't see anyone disarming Hezbollah. So I'm less optimistic than some of your other reporters were.
So, Alan, I guess that begs the question then, why agree to a ceasefire, and what could conceivably come out of it then?
Well, he had no choice. And here's the paradox of all this, Riley. The Iranians, those that both Trump and Netanyahu claim that they have been obliterated and eviscerated and annihilated and decimated and have nothing, shut the Strait of Hormuz again, saying that a Lebanon ceasefire is part of their ceasefire deal with the U.S.,
right,
which the U.S. agreed to, but then a day later reneged on the 9th of April. So now the Iranians are basically proving to Trump that if he wants to do business, and he does want to do business because he wants out of this debacle that he got himself into, if he wants to conclude a deal with Iran, Lebanon needs to be on the table. Until 2 or 3 days ago, Riley, I don't think anyone heard Mr. Trump even mention Lebanon. He couldn't care less about Lebanon. It's got nothing to do with his war with Iran, according to him. Now, all of a sudden, he has an opportunity to pivot away from the failure of the war with Iran, and it was a failure in many respects, and claim that he's orchestrated another spectacular war-ending peace agreement. Once he made that decision to pivot, he made it, I assume, he made it unequivocally clear to Mr. Netanyahu that the ceasefire has to happen, and it has to happen in the next 48 hours.
So this is my question then, Alan, sorry if I can jump in on you, is how much then of this ceasefire depends on the fact that the U.S. president is trying to make a deal with Iran? Because at the beginning you said that you believe that Netanyahu was forced into this by the president.
Yeah,
so doesn't
exactly.
the president then have some weight to hold this ceasefire, to tell Israel that, like, at least this 10 days, there is a ceasefire here?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. That's what I meant. Per your question, how much of that has to do with the president trying to strike a deal with Iran? 99%. Would he force Israel to abide by the ceasefire? 100%. Will the ceasefire hold is a different matter. I don't know. Because of what I mentioned a moment earlier, based on what your reporter said a few moments ago, that if South Lebanon is off the table and is not under the jurisdiction, per se, of such a ceasefire, then the ceasefire will collapse pretty soon. By the way, the Lebanese would not agree to it.
Right.
And so the ceasefire has to be adhered to 100%. And I think you're right, Riley. Trump will make it abundantly clear to Netanyahu to abide by the ceasefire.
And so, Alan, because we know that Netanyahu has already said that leaving South Lebanon during this ceasefire is off the table, is there something political, whether it's normalizations with Lebanon, whether it's something else, is there like a political goal at the end of this that could outweigh the need for this military operation?
Conceivably, yes. You know, if Israel withdraws from Lebanon, I mean, there's not going to be any peace deal. There's not going to be any normalization as long as Israel, according to the Lebanese, is occupying a portion of their country in South Lebanon between the Israeli border and the Litani River, which is just a few miles, but nonetheless, it's a buffer. And until and after Israel withdraws from there, there's not going to be any peace deal, let alone diplomatic relations and normalization. Is there a silver lining? Yes. If Hezbollah ceases to be a military force and goes back to being the way it started, a social and political movement, then Israel has no say on the matter. But, you know, it's been 3 decades that people have been making that argument, and it hasn't happened until now.
Okay. Alan Pincus, a former Israeli diplomat. We always appreciate your insight here on Al Jazeera. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Pakistan is pressing ahead with mediation efforts between the U.S. and Iran. A Pakistani delegation is in Tehran. Pakistan's foreign ministry spokesperson says there's still a lot of pressure on both those countries to agree to a long-term ceasefire.
Pakistan has been and will continue to play its role to facilitate engagement and dialogue between the two countries in the days to come. And indeed, these words of the Deputy Prime Minister are being upheld now that our Chief of Defense Forces was in Iran yesterday, arrived in Iran yesterday, and our Prime Minister has embarked on a 3 countries visit. Let me reiterate that the visit to Saudi Arabia and Qatar has, of course, a very strong bilateral component as well.
Okay, let's discuss all of this further with our guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Barbara Slavin, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and an expert on U.S. foreign policy and Iran. Also in Washington, D.C. is Hassan Menemne. He's a political analyst and researcher at the Middle East Institute. Thanks to both of you for being here. Hassan, I want to start with you, and I want to talk about this ceasefire that's happening in Lebanon. We've been reporting from Israel that this is a tough sell for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, but how is this being received in Lebanon? Will everybody there be on board with it?
Well, with a lot of skepticism for sure, but also with a lot of pride on the part of the government that is portraying it as an achievement, as a way forward. The skepticism is more on the part of Hezbollah, clearly, but also a large segment of the Lebanese population, which realizes that it's not that Netanyahu was coerced into it as much as Netanyahu has a modus operandi here, which is to say yes for the US president, but then do whatever he wants to do. And in this case, the many gaps, the many holes that were left in terms of framing this ceasefire indicates that basically there might be a little bit of a lull in the attacks, but in particular with regard to the south, everything will continue. The claim that Israel will not withdraw from a security zone, Hezbollah has responded to it immediately by saying, therefore it is occupation, therefore resistance is a right. The actual bombing of the last bridge that links the area south of Litani to the area north of Litani indicates that Israel still has that large swath of territory that it was unable to capture by force because of the fierce resistance in Bint Jbeil, in Khiyam, and elsewhere, is still within its desire to occupy. And therefore, I think people would like to have a little bit of a sense of, okay, there is a rest here, but I think skepticism dominates all over the place.
Barbara, to you in Washington, how important is this ceasefire now to the ceasefire discussions that are happening between Washington and Iran, and how closely will the president be making sure that this ceasefire holds?
First of all, thanks for having me. I think it's very important to keep the ceasefire going between the United States and Iran and Israel and Iran. And whether we're really going to get an agreement or a framework agreement, or whether we're just going to keep kicking the can down the road for a good period of time is what I'm wondering. President Trump sounded very optimistic, but we know that we get whiplash listening to him, and that tomorrow he can be talking again about bombing bridges and power plants in Iran. So I think this is an important piece. We will see if it holds. We will see if Hezbollah will hold off attacks, and if Israel will not go after new targets. I think it's very important that Israel stops bombing Beirut. Those scenes of entire apartment blocks being blown to smithereens made it impossible, I think, for the Iranians to reach any sort of agreement. But there still seems to be a lot of gaps when it comes to uranium enrichment. Trump apparently said that Iran had agreed to turn over its stockpile of highly enriched uranium, which he persists in calling dust for some reason, even though it's a gas. And there's no indication that Iran has come close to agreeing to U.S. terms on any of this. Look, de-escalation is good. A continued ceasefire is good. We still have the issue of the Strait of Hormuz, and not very much clarity on that, although there are reports that Iran is allowing more traffic in the area that's close to the coast with Oman, but more questions than answers still.
Hassan, President Trump says that they are going to see if they can make peace. What does peace look like here between Lebanon and Israel?
Beyond the usual, basically variable talk that President Trump often utters, which I'm talking here about the contradictions or the promises with a high ceiling that have no footing in reality, there's really cognitive dissonance here to pretend that there can be peace between Israel and Lebanon, while we're just a week away from the so-called Operation Eternal Darkness, in which Israel has committed what seems to me at least, that it is an attempt at marketing its weaponry by hitting 100 targets within a span of 10 minutes, targets that I was there to witness were not military targets, were civilian targets, were meant to have an effect of shock and awe. But the only shock and awe that they produce is further dissatisfaction with any possibility of a peace. Yes, there is a segment of the Lebanese population that is exhausted to the point of saying any arrangement is better than these unending wars, especially when these wars do not seem to be footed in some actual Lebanese interest. But overwhelmingly, there is no sense of trust at all in any possible peace or any possible deal with Israel. At best, I mean, what people seem to be seeking is a situation of truce, whether it's a return to the 1949 armistice or any UN or even Arab resolution to that effect. But the expectation of a peace treaty normalization is actually beyond any imagination at this point. Actually, small steps here. If the US is able to secure a withdrawal of the Israeli forces, and I doubt it, because the intent here on the part of Israel was not just getting to Bint Jbeil and face the resistance, but getting all the way to the Litani River. So I think on the part of Israel, the claim that peace is the intent here is simply to delay what Israel seeks to achieve. And on the part of the Lebanese government, clearly there's a lot of hope, but very little ability to implement. On the part of Hezbollah, it's not unlike Israel. We'll wait and see, and we expect to see something very bad, and therefore we resume fighting. All of this is clearly, from Trump's point of view, Lebanon is just a way to offer the Iranians, in the pursuit of the framework, a card to their satisfaction in order to say, here is something that we offer and offer something in return. It is not about Lebanon. Lebanon is not well conceived in terms of what to do about it, because Israel has had the ability to cause whatever damage it can cause, and it seems to have done quite a bit of that.
So if that is the case, Barbara, and we don't know yet if either party has accepted this, But how much pressure does an invite to the White House for the leaders of these countries put on whatever negotiations or talks for peace are happening?
Well, I mean, if Trump invites them, I suppose they will come. Certainly Netanyahu wouldn't mind coming. But, how meaningful is it? I mean, we have a state of Lebanon, and Hassan knows this very well, that does not have a monopoly of force and is unable to disarm Hezbollah, as we've seen, despite brutal attacks by the Israelis. So, Trump he starts wars and then he says he ends them, so he can say he's a peacemaker. And this is the same individual who is in a fight with the Pope because the Pope says that he should be a peacemaker and not a warmonger. I never pay that much attention to what Donald Trump says. I watch what he does. And there are more American forces headed to the region as we speak. So we have a ceasefire, a fragile ceasefire with Iran that goes on for about another week. And I'm watching to see if there is a way now with this supposed Lebanon ceasefire to extend the Iran ceasefire and maybe work out some arrangements for the Strait of Hormuz, maybe get another round of talks in Pakistan that will narrow differences. But so far, I've not seen that the Trump administration is changing its maximalist demands regarding the Iranian nuclear program.
Right.
And without that, I just don't see an agreement.
We will see what the next hour and a half brings, at least. Barbara Slavin, fellow at the Stimson Center, and Hassan Menemne, political analyst at the Middle East Institute. Thank you both for being with us here on Al Jazeera. This is Al Jazeera. Here is a reminder of our top stories this hour. U.S. President Donald Trump has announced a ceasefire in Lebanon that is set to come into effect in less than 2 hours. Trump said it will include Hezbollah. He also said that Iran has agreed to hand over its enriched uranium and added that the two sides were close to a peace deal to end 6 weeks of conflict. A second round of talks between the U.S. and Iran could very likely take place in Islamabad again. A Pakistani delegation is currently in Tehran to deliver messages from the U.S. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has given more detail about the nature of the U.S. naval operations in the Strait of Hormuz. General Dan Kane said the U.S. is specifically targeting Iran.
Let me be clear. This blockade applies to all ships, regardless of nationality, heading into or from Iranian ports. The U.S. action is a blockade of Iran's ports and coastline, not a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Enforcement will occur inside Iran's territorial seas and in international waters. In addition to this blockade, the joint force, through operations and activities in other areas of responsibility, like the Pacific area of responsibility under the command of Admiral Paparo, will actively pursue any Iranian-flagged vessel or any vessel attempting to provide material support to Iran. This includes dark fleet vessels carrying Iranian oil. As most of you know, dark fleet vessels are those illicit or illegal ships evading international regulations, sanctions, or insurance requirements.
President Trump says the U.S. blockade on Iran has been more effective than airstrikes.
Take a look at the blockade. Nobody's ever seen anything like it. That blockade is the best thing to... And I'll tell you something, I think the blockade has been more powerful than the bombs. The bombs were powerful, and it weakened them. They have no Navy, they have no Air Force, they have no anything, they have no leaders. But their new leaders, the ones that have replaced them, it's a regime change. They are much more, I think, frankly, more intelligent and more moderate. But we have a real chance to make a deal very soon with Iran.
And joining us now from Philadelphia is Scott Eulinger, a retired U.S. Navy officer and a former senior CIA officer. Thank you very much for being with us here on Al Jazeera.
Thank you.
I want to ask you, we know that this is a massive undertaking, this blockade of the Strait of Hormuz by the United States. 10,000 soldiers, a dozen ships, dozens of aircraft. Do we know how much of the resources that the U.S. has in the region that is taking part in this blockade at the moment?
Well, certainly, I'd say it's probably roughly 20% of the U.S. Navy's combined power. Viewers have to understand that this.
Sorry, Scott, to jump in, is that in total, or is that what is in the Gulf region at the moment?
No, I'm speaking about 20% of the entire U.S. Navy.
Okay, thank you.
And the majority of Central Command vessels are involved in this. So that is correct. However, the Navy is built to spend considerable times at sea conducting operations. And this operation can continue for quite some time because the Navy's been doing this sort of thing for more than 200 years. Now, the blockade is actually what is called a distant blockade. And that means that the United States Navy is not hovering outside of Iranian ports. And in fact, it's not really in the Strait of Hormuz either. Instead, the U.S. Navy is outside in the Gulf of Oman and the Arabian Sea, and using intelligence assets, helicopters, drones, etc., to monitor vessels which are free to transit the Straits of Hormuz. If these vessels are going to allied nations that don't include Iran, they're certainly welcome to do that, drop their cargo and head on out with more cargo if they like. However, Iran is under blockade, which means any vessels that are already in Iranian ports are not permitted to leave, and any additional vessels which seek to enter Iranian ports are not permitted. If they do this, then it's possible the U.S. Navy may allow them to conduct their business. But once they exit the Strait of Hormuz, the vessels will be boarded, inspected, and potentially confiscated in accordance with international law on the guidance on how to conduct a blockade.
Scott, if the U.S. returns to fighting at the end of this period of ceasefire, as the president and the defense secretary have said may happen, does this blockade end or fall apart? Are those resources going to be needed elsewhere? Because we just heard the president say that he thinks this blockade has been more effective than the airstrikes. Can the two things happen at the same time?
That's a very good question. Yes, they actually can happen at the same time. And that is because it is a distant blockade, meaning the vast majority of vessels are outside the Straits of Hormuz. So they're not going to be endangered by any potential but much reduced Iranian firepower. However, aircraft carriers outside will be able to conduct bombing operations without a problem. And as well, destroyers can not only guard the carriers, but they'll also be able to conduct boarding parties and searches of vessels that are violating the blockade. So yes, I think for at least 2 months, the U.S. Navy will be able to do both operations at the same time, understanding that there are also additional vessels headed toward the region.
Okay, Scott, so how concerned will the U.S. be at this point from pressure from outside the region? I understand that, as you were explaining, the blockade from the U.S. perspective is on Iranian ports, but the fact of the matter still is that all of this 20% of oil and gas that the world uses that comes from the Strait of Hormuz is not moving. So how significant is the pressure going to get before there has to be some relief from this blockade?
Well, we have to understand that the reason the tankers are not transiting has nothing to do with the United States, and it has to do with maritime insurance rates and fear of Iranian attack. Now, during the ceasefire, I think that the tankers don't really have to fear Iranian attack. However, if conflict starts again, they potentially have to be concerned about that. But we have to keep in mind that at least 90% of Iran's ability to attack shipping has been destroyed. The potential of mining the Strait of Hormuz does not seem to have really materialized, although U.S. mine hunters are inbound to the area. And so that is why President Trump has offered an alternative to London maritime insurance, because this way he feels it is basically because of prohibitive costs that the tankers are not entering and exiting the straits, more than a fear of Iranian missiles. And certainly the U.S. Navy is doing what it can to keep the straits open, and they are indeed open right now.
Well, we will see how many tankers move through there. Scott Eulinger, retired U.S. Navy veteran, thank you for being with us here on Al Jazeera. We appreciate it. The U.S. naval blockade of Iran's ports could hurt its economy. Most of its trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz off its southern coast. Iran was already under severe restrictions before the war, and now with maritime traffic blocked, it is looking at alternative ways to maintain trade with its partners. Ume Kulsum Sharif explains.
The U.S. military says its naval blockade of Iranian ports has completely stopped traffic to and from Iran. Earlier, Central Command said it's turned back several ships and that no ships had broken its blockade on Iranian ports since the operation began on Monday. Now, Iran has disputed that claim, and shipping data shows that some U.S.-sanctioned vessels have entered the Gulf despite the blockade. Now, Iran relies heavily on its southern coast and the ports here for most of its trade. About 90% of Iran's economy relies on international trade that arrives by sea. While most of the world economy was struggling last month, Iran has had a profitable March. And that's because it's continued to export its energy products using the Strait of Hormuz, while it severely restricted other countries from doing so since the start of the war. And its daily revenue, some reports say its daily revenues in March was close to $140 million, up from $115 million, while other nations producing oil and gas in the very region have been counting losses. Iran has begun to explore alternative shipping routes to bypass the U.S. naval blockade. Analysts consider the Just port here a critical plan B. It extends from Gorek here and goes right down, bypassing the crucial Strait of Hormuz. The Chabahar port is another trade port on the Gulf of Oman that seems to be critical for trade connecting to Afghanistan and Central Asia. Now, it was developed by India, but a U.S. sanctions waiver on the port is set to expire later this month. Iran is also exploring the northern ports along the Caspian Sea. Now, they are seen as vital trade hubs connecting to Central Asia and further up to Russia. Now, Iran shares its border with 7 countries, and it's connecting with its partners using land corridors to continue trade flows using road, rail, and sea routes.
The UK's Deputy Prime Minister has been visiting Kuwait to discuss regional developments in relation to the Iran war. Malik Traina reports from Kuwait City.
We're here in the British Embassy in Kuwait City, where David Lammy, the UK's Deputy Prime Minister, is finishing his Gulf tour. He was in Oman earlier. He's now here in Kuwait, meeting with senior officials. They're discussing bilateral relations, including defense, security, and energy. They'll also be talking about the ceasefire and the Hormuz Strait. Lammy also met with British servicemen who are based here. Now, the UK and France are co-hosting an international conference on efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz.
It's hugely important that the United Kingdom and France are convening this coalition of countries coming together once we have a ceasefire to do 2 things. 1, to ensure that it's sustained, and 2, to ensure that we get back to freedom of navigation as quickly as possible. If there have been mines laid, we will sweep them. If there is security needed, we will put that in place. All of it to bring confidence back to business and industry so that vessels and ships can pass with ease up the Strait and we can come back to normality in the global economy as soon as possible.
From the Gulf's perspective, they are calling for de-escalation. They want a diplomatic path, and Iran and the U.S. to agree on a comprehensive solution that brings peace and long-term stability to this entire region. Malik Traina, Al Jazeera, Kuwait City.
Let's take a look at some of the day's other news. Pope Leo has held a mass in the largest English-speaking city in a country where most people speak French. Huge crowds gathered in Bamenda to hear the message from the head of the Roman Catholic Church. Many hope the visit will bring attention to years of separatist violence in the region. It's killed thousands of people since 2017. Cameroon is Pope Leo's second stop on a four-nation tour of Africa. Nicholas Hawk reports from Bamenda.
People are gathering at the main cathedral in Bamenda to hear an English-speaking pope speaking to the English-speaking people of the northwest region of Cameroon. For armed groups, this is the capital of Ambazonia, and they've been waging a war with government forces. Thousands of people have been killed and 500,000 people displaced, and people here hope that the Pope can bring a message of peace. But they're one of the lucky few because getting here is dangerous. There's heavy security presence here because outside of the premises in the distance are hideouts for Ambazonian fighters, and there's been several attacks ahead of the Pope's visit. Now, they have called for a truce for the Pope's presence here, but many people here want to see more than that. They're calling for a permanent ceasefire and a solution to this conflict that has lasted far too long.
Added to these internal problems, which are often fueled by hatred and violence, is the damage caused from outside by those who, in the name of profit, continue to lay their hands on the African continent to exploit and plunder it. This is the moment to change, to transform the story of this country.
Praise the Lord. Yeah.
More than a symbol and a message for peace, he spoke of a few tyrants holding this world. Pope Leo, in the heart of the English-speaking region, calling out the powerful to a congregation here that is hoping that peace will finally come to their region. Nicholas Hawk, Al Jazeera, Bamenda.
English-speaking separatists in Cameroon's northwest have been calling for calm during the Pope's visit to the region. Their decade of armed conflict is rooted in European colonial rule. In 1919, control of Cameroon was split between Britain and France. They developed rival systems. After independence in 1961, English-speaking regions became part of a state dominated by French speakers. A decade later, Cameroon dismantled its federal system, tightening majority control, and that only deepened divisions. In 2016, English speakers protested against what they saw as government discrimination. Authorities responded with violence. A year later, Anglophone separatists began an armed insurgency. Since then, fighting has killed at least 6,000 people and displaced more than 700,000. Each side has accused the other of abuses, and peace efforts have repeatedly stalled. Joining us now from Chicago is Stan Chuilo. He's a research professor of Catholic and African Studies at DePaul University and the editor of the Handbook of African Catholicism. Thank you so much for being with us here on Al Jazeera. We appreciate it. Tell us what the significance is of this leg of the Pope's visit.
Thank you very much for that question. We already see the significance. Here is a Pope calling out the tyrants, the dictators, and the bad leaders who are holding Africa in this perpetual stranglehold. So Pope Leo chose to go to Cameroon because Cameroon, like Algeria, have been also touched profoundly by colonialism. We see the lingering effects of colonialism in Africa, wars and violence. Africans were not fighting each other. Yes, there were, as one will see in history, occasional conflict, but this weaponization of ethnicity, of language, of people who before now lived together in peace by imposing these national borders we see the devastating impact of that. So Pope Leo sees himself as a peace builder. When he became Pope, he defined his papacy as building bridges across religions, across races, across ethnicities. And that is what he's doing. You see that he went in Algeria, he went to the Great Mosque in Algiers, just like he did in Istanbul, going to the Sultan, the Blue Mosque. That is showing deep reverence for other religions. And he has consistently maintained that it is time for the world to put an end to violence and war, because this is not the civilization that we all long for.
Right. We know that African Catholics are becoming a very large part of the church and of the faithful. I wonder how much influence the Pope has here to make those kinds of changes or to bring those kinds of thoughts and processes to the region.
Change is a gradual process. But when the head of the Catholic Church, like the Pope, is the one saying the same thing that many poor people, many suffering masses of our people, saying it now publicly, it carries enormous weight. It's not going to happen overnight, but he was standing before the president of Cameroon to say, put an end to corruption. He used the word tyrants. He used the word exploitation, because his words are not only addressed to the African leaders, the bad leaders, some of them, it's also being addressed to the world, because the world is manipulating and exploiting Africa. Africa has become now the site for geopolitical warfare. And when you see a president like Paul Biya in Cameroon, who's been in power for 43 years, or as we will see when the Pope goes to Equatorial Guinea, President Teodoro, who's been in power for 47 years, they are in power because they also have foreign accomplices who are enabling their stranglehold on power and their state capture. So I think Pope Leo is speaking both to Africa and to the world, that Africa should not be forgotten, Africa should not be exploited, but internal colonialism, we Africans have to address it ourselves, because what we see now is the battle for the second liberation of Africa from internal colonialism on one hand, and from the lingering colonial domination of the continent and exploitation of Africa's natural resources.
Stan, I want to ask you briefly as well, because, of course, the Pope is been in a very public spat with the United States president with his calls for peace around the world. I wonder, do you think that's influencing his trip here at all, or is that something he's not concerning himself with?
Well, I think that President Trump decided to insert himself in a very unacceptable way into what was for Pope Leo a pilgrimage of peace. So Pope Leo is not really a politician. He's just calling out the moral and spiritual bankruptcy of a mentality that thinks that you can build peace through violence. It's a contradiction.
Right.
You can't build peace through threats or through punishing the innocent or through spilling the blood of non-combatants. Dialogue is what Pope Leo is calling for: reconciliation, forgiveness, servant and humble leadership, and a world of fraternity and friendship. I think that...
Stan, I'm so sorry. I have to jump in on you, Stan Chuilo, but we have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us from Chicago to talk about the Pope's visit to Africa. We really appreciate your time and your insight here. Our extensive coverage of the ceasefire in the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran continues in just a moment. But reminder, you can get the news whenever you need it, including up-to-date breaking news and analysis on our website at aljazeera.com. I'm Riley Carlson, and we'll have reports live for you from Washington, D.C., from Tehran, and from the West Bank in just a few minutes.
This whole peace process is a very clear indicator of the more multipolar, more Westless world that we live in.
There are lots of cases of breaking their promises even before the negotiations.
It is in the interest of the Israelis to continue the fight, whereas it is the interest of the United States to end the hostilities.
Iran has been decimated. They don't want to go back to one day before the bombing started.
President Trump doesn't like to bluff. He likes to be very direct with his negotiations.
He wants to say, well, I'm actually a deal maker, not a war maker, and my pressure tactic worked.
Stay with Al Jazeera for the latest developments.
The Iranian regime can never have nuclear weapons, and they need to stop sponsoring terrorism.
The United States started this war, and the Zionist regime started it.
The Straits of Hormuz will be open.
The strait is currently open and is closed only to those who are at war with Iran.
Attack Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain. That is the range of these weapons.
We attack American facilities, American forces.
Get the full picture on Al Jazeera.
When the war is going to be over.
As soon as we achieve our objectives.
Hello, I'm Riley Carlson. This is Al Jazeera and our extensive coverage of the conflict in Lebanon and the ceasefire between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. U.S. President Donald Trump announces a ceasefire in Lebanon and says the leaders of Israel and Lebanon will be meeting in the coming days. Israel has been heavily attacking Lebanon, destroying a major bridge connecting the south to the rest of the country. Also ahead, Iran had made clear that any progress in talks in ending the war depended on halting Israeli strikes in Lebanon. President Trump says a deal with Tehran could be as close as this weekend.
It's going to be a good deal. It's going to be a deal with no nuclear weapons.
I'm Jonah Hull in London, and European markets opened higher, cautiously optimistic about a potential resolution to the Middle East conflict.
Thank you for joining us. U.S. President Donald Trump says a ceasefire in Lebanon, which comes into effect less than an hour from now, will include Hezbollah. Israel has been bombarding and occupying huge parts of southern Lebanon, saying it's targeting Hezbollah. More than 2,000 people have been killed. Over 1 million people have been displaced. Trump's first announced the ceasefire on social media.
It's very exciting because it's 48 years. We're going to be meeting with Bibi Netanyahu, as you know, and the president of Lebanon. And I had a great talk with both of them today. They're going to be having a ceasefire, and that'll include Hezbollah. And I think it could be number 10 for me.
We are live this hour in Tehran, Ramallah, and in Washington, D.C., which is where we will begin with Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna, who joins us now live from the White House. Mike, Donald Trump was just there that we listened to announcing the ceasefire in Lebanon and also inviting the leaders of Israel and Lebanon to come to the White House. How has all of this come together?
Well, this is not something that happened suddenly, although the announcement did come rather rapidly. But basically, we were told at State Department when the countries were meeting at ambassadorial level that those meetings had been started to be planned as far long ago as a month. So there was a month in the making of that ambassadorial meeting. Then after that ambassadorial meeting, things started happening very quickly. President Trump has been in telephone contact with the Prime Minister of Israel, with the President of Lebanon, Michel Aoun, and he has been also speaking to the Emir of Qatar in the past 24 hours. So he has been doing this telephone diplomacy, which has led to this announcement now of a ceasefire coming up between Israel and Lebanon, a substantial potential agreement here. The actual agreement we're still to see. It is being drawn up at present, and the leaders will be coming to the White House, says President Trump, He said initially within a matter of weeks, now it is within the next 4 to 5 days that they will be here, presumably, to officially sign that peace deal.
Okay, Mike, we will speak to you again in just a couple of moments. But first, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that Israel will continue to occupy Lebanese territory despite President Donald Trump announcing a ceasefire in Lebanon.
In these peace talks, we have two fundamental demands. First, the disarmament of Hezbollah. Second, a sustainable peace agreement, peace through strength. In order to achieve the ceasefire, Hezbollah insisted on two conditions. The first condition was that Israel must withdraw from all Lebanese territory up to the international border. The second condition was a ceasefire based on a quiet-for-quiet arrangement. I did not agree to either of these, and indeed, neither of these conditions is being met.
Let's bring in Nida Ibrahim now, who joins us live from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. So, Nida, Benjamin Netanyahu, they're insisting that his forces will not leave southern Lebanon. Was that expected?
That was expected because this is the only paper that Netanyahu could use to try and tell his his people, his audience, his potential voters by the end of this year that he achieved something. Remember, when he started this battle, he said that the disarmament of Hezbollah would stay the main goal. Yes, it might be difficult to achieve that just by occupying large parts of southern Lebanon. But he's now trying to say that the places that the Israeli army has expanded to are already enough to prevent the threat coming from Hezbollah that is threatening the soldiers, but also threatening the communities in northern Israel. These communities have already criticized him, saying that he failed to protect them, that this is a capitulation and not just a ceasefire, that he could not evacuate nor provide safety and security to the communities there. Remember, we've also been talking about the Israeli army statements in the past few weeks, saying that they have been underestimating the power of Hezbollah and that it has rockets that have the ability to travel long distances. Also, it's worth mentioning that in the past hour, the Israeli army says more than 25 rockets from Hezbollah were fired into northern Israel. This is yet another reminder that the group's capabilities are alive, are well, and they are coming from a place of strength here, despite the damage that has been incurred to the party and to the group through the continued Israeli strikes. So in total, this is a man who's trying to damage control, if you may, trying to do as much as he can to convince his people that he was on board with this ceasefire, although everyone knows he was not.
Okay, Nida, so you mentioned there the people in northern Israel have been criticizing this, the people that Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying are the ones being protected by this military operation in southern Lebanon. How then is this going to be presented to the people of Israel to present it as a success or something that they should get behind?
Well, when we talk about the refusal to withdraw Israeli troops from southern Lebanon, he's trying to portray that as a success, as a victory. So he's trying to cling to that point. Another point he's clinging on is the fact that he wants the Lebanese government and the Lebanese army to take on the role of disarming Hezbollah, something that was not possible by military force itself. And it wasn't enough to do that just by bombarding the group. And all of that is weakening Netanyahu's position. Despite how many times and how many ways he tries to spin this, it still is a point of weakness that Trump announced 2 ceasefires despite Israeli interests wanting to continue striking on both fronts, on Lebanon and Iran as well. All of that is being seen in Israel as a weakness. This is something that was criticized by the opposition leader Yair Lapid, who's saying that Netanyahu has failed time and again to achieve his promises to the Israeli people. This is something they will not forget when they head to elections later this year. And that's exactly why Netanyahu has been clinging to this war, a war that he wanted to start for decades when we talk about his war with Iran. So in that ceasefire, he will also be looking for ways to sabotage it. He will be looking for ways to keep bombarding. He will continue to find ways and try and lobby with President Trump to hit, if not Lebanon, but Iran.
Nida Ibrahim reporting live for us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Thank you, Nida. Now let's bring in Ali Hashim, who joins us live from the Iranian capital of Tehran. Ali, Tehran had always insisted that the ceasefire that is taking place now between the U.S. and Iran had to also include Lebanon in order for negotiations to go forward. So have Iranian leaders been responding to this news of this ceasefire that is supposed to take effect in about an hour's time?
Well, there's been several positions coming from Iran welcoming the ceasefire. Let me just take the opportunity to read directly from the latest lines we are receiving. The Speaker of the Parliament, Mohammad Baqir Qalibaf, who is also the head of the Iranian delegation to the negotiations with the United States, welcomed this ceasefire and said that Iran and the resistance in reference to Hezbollah are one. So this is, he said, as I said last night, the ceasefire was only the result of the remarkable steadfastness of Hezbollah's heroes and the unity of the resistance axis. We will approach this ceasefire with caution, and we stand together until full victory is achieved. Then he thanks the government of Pakistan. The second position came from Ismail Qaani, who is the commander of Iran's IRGC Quds force, that is actually the ally of Hezbollah also. He said if the ceasefire is achieved, it's the result of the steadfast and resolute stand of the Lebanese resistance. Also, the advisor to the Supreme Leader, Mujtaba Khamenei, Mohsen Rizai, says the resistance of Hezbollah fighters and Iran multifaceted pressure, the Strait of Hormuz and the suspension of negotiations resulted in imposing a ceasefire on the Zionist entity, as he says. So for Iran, this is very important, especially that, as we reported yesterday, they were among the first to be informed about the ceasefire, and it was a main condition that they placed. Actually, as we remember last week when the Pakistani Prime Minister announced the ceasefire, he mentioned Lebanon. So to them, it's a success, regardless of who is going to claim the being behind the ceasefire.
Okay, Ali, stay with us. As we've been reporting, more than 2,000 people have been killed in Lebanon since the start of March. More than 1.2 million have been forced from their homes by Israel's invasion, evacuation orders, and airstrikes. And as people wait for the expected ceasefire, the displaced are wondering if and when they will be able to go home. Malcolm Webb reports from a restaurant in a Christian village near the city of Sidon that's been hosting displaced people from Shia communities.
People living in this village in southern Lebanon fled their homes at the start of last month following the Israeli military's evacuation orders, and it's been subjected to airstrikes repeatedly since then. And it's a similar story for almost all of the villages south of there. But where we are, in the Christian majority village, the population's still here. One of the residents is the owner of this restaurant. When the displacement crisis began, about 1.2 million people have been forced from their home. He closed his doors to diners and opened it up instead. People, Shia Muslim communities who were fleeing from the south. There's now about 70 people staying here.
The kitchen is now a communal one. Israel's invasion has fueled sectarian tensions in some parts of Lebanon. Some people are reluctant to accept displaced Shia communities because they're scared of being targeted by Israeli airstrikes. But not here.
We come to here, restaurant. We very happy in the restaurant. Restaurant is found all our need. We feel happy.
The village of Kfar Fila is less than 20 minutes drive away.
Suddenly we heard rockets launching and war. We grabbed our things and left our homes. We reached a school used for displaced people and we waited for it to open, but it didn't. So we were driving around in the car until we found this restaurant. We won't find a better place than this.
Livelihoods have been left behind and incomes lost. Meals delivered by charities help. Charles Hellu, the restaurant's owner, says everyone should feel at home.
1, 2, hey!
He was keen to show us what it's like here when there isn't war and mass displacement. He says Friday nights are special, but he says everyone from every village belongs to one community, and so now he must help.
Sure I will close my business. Oh, where did people go? Can you tell me? Where? In the streets? No. All of us are human beings, so we need the peace.
Home is not far away, but it's not safe. Religions may differ between villages. There's death and destruction just down the road, but here, humanity prevails.
Dozens of beds line the floor of the dining room. People normally be eating meals. Each of the families has used bar stools to divide up their own space for a bit of privacy. Charles says he looks forward to when people are dancing on this floor once again. All of the families here say they want to go home. Everyone says they just want peace. Malcolm Webb, Al Jazeera, Sidon, Lebanon.
President Trump says the U.S. is close to making a deal with Iran. He also said the two countries have a very good relationship, but repeated that Tehran cannot be allowed to have a nuclear weapon.
It's looking very good that we're going to make a deal with Iran, and it's going to be a good deal. It's going to be a deal with no nuclear weapons.
When is the next in-person round of negotiations on the war in Iran? When will
They're
that
all
take place?
important. I mean, it's not a question of around. All of them are important.
When will the next in-person
Probably,
meeting take
maybe
place?
over the weekend.
Let's bring Mike Hanna back in from the White House and Ali Hashim back in from Tehran. Let's start actually with you, Ali. Trump is optimistic about these negotiations, okay. I'm going to go to Mike Hanna first there. We're having some problems with Ali's communication, but that's fine. Mike, thank you for being there. The president is suggesting that a deal with Iran is still on the horizon. Do we have any more details, or has the president elaborated any more on why that is?
Well, the key to the president's apparent optimism about a deal upcoming is the fact that he claims a very powerful proposal has been put forward that beyond 20 years, they will not have nuclear weapons. And now he was touting this as a sign that the U.S. pressure has been working. He's also talking about, he was asked whether he would consider extending the ceasefire. He said that may not be necessary if a deal is made, implying that there is a possibility of a deal. But to get back to that nuclear weapons statement, the Iranian nuclear policy has been based on a 2003 fatwa by the then supreme leader who was assassinated at the beginning of this conflict, saying that it was haram or forbidden for Iran to develop or have nuclear weapons of any form. So that is the official state policy at present. Some argue that it is purely symbolic, that Iran has been trying to get round it, but very clearly there is in the basis of the Iranian government or institutional memory the knowledge that at some stages nuclear weapons are forbidden. So this is a doable point, and President Trump has made much of this renunciation of nuclear weapons as an absolute crucial point of getting back to talks again. Another point that he has brought up, he was asked whether if these negotiations begin again, if a deal is reached, would he go to Pakistan, which is where the original negotiations were taking place, to be there? He said, yes, I might go to Pakistan should an agreement be reached and need signing. So there does appear to be a lot of movement here, far beyond the president's sunny optimism. There does appear to be some substance to his insistence that there is the possibility of a new deal.
Al Jazeera's Mike Hanna reporting live for us from the White House. Mike, thank you. Let's take all of that back to Ali Hashim, who is live in the Iranian capital. Ali, as Mike was just telling us, the president is optimistic about these negotiations. He has said that there's been movement on agreements to the nuclear program, which have been a sticking point in these negotiations. What is Iran saying about this?
Well, in Tehran, there's a lot of mistrust, a lot of cautiousness, given the fact that what they are currently describing as contradictory positions are still being expressed by American leaders and officials, especially when it comes to the enrichment issue. So what we heard from a source who spoke to an Iranian platform that's associated with the foreign ministry, that the positive signs are just made for media hype, and that the main issue here is for them to be used in the market to change the market, and at the same time that the contradictory positions coming from the United States and also the sabotaging efforts by the Israelis, as they said, are quite very concerning for the Iranians, and that's why they're concerned. And this also applies to the issue of the ceasefire. Now, given the fact there is this news coming from Lebanon about the ceasefire, this could ease things in a way or another. However, another sticking point stays, which is the unfreezing of the Iranian assets. Now, let me just read something that just came in now from the Iranian Foreign Ministry, a position on the ceasefire in Lebanon. Ismail Baqai, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, welcomed the announcement of the ceasefire in Lebanon, noting that ending the war in Lebanon was part of the ceasefire understanding between Iran and the United States mediated by Pakistan. He stated that from the outset, Iran talks with the various regional and international parties, including the Islamabad negotiations. The Islamic Republic of Iran emphasized the necessity of establishing a simultaneous ceasefire across the entire region, including Lebanon, and continued to pursue the matter seriously. So this is the main line coming from the Iranian Foreign Ministry, commenting on the ceasefire in Lebanon also.
Okay, thank you for bringing that to us. Al Jazeera's Ali Hashim live for us in Tehran. Thank you. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's discuss it further with our guests. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Barbara Slavin, a distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center and an expert on U.S. foreign policy and Iran. Also in Washington, D.C. is Hassan Menemne. He's a political analyst and a researcher at the Middle East Institute. Thanks to you both for being with us once again. Hassan, I will begin with you. Given what the U.S. president has said about his optimism about a deal with Iran, how big of a part of that was achieving this ceasefire agreement in Lebanon?
Yeah, the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon seems to be, from the point of view of Donald Trump, a low-cost offering to Iran in order to make the framework deal that the U.S. administration is seeking with Iran possible. In itself, clearly the U.S. was not that much concerned, I would say. Trump was not concerned about this particular item in what Iran had asked for, because there seemed to have been an Iranian and Pakistani clear understanding that a ceasefire in Lebanon is part of any negotiations, part of any progress on the Iranian-US front. But then Netanyahu convinced Donald Trump that's not the case. Now there is a reversal of sorts, a reversal clearly not to the liking of the Israeli prime minister, but the Israeli prime minister has his ways. He can say yes, and then it is a huge welcoming yes, but. And in saying the but, he can introduce all sorts of elements. And there seems to be in this deal quite a few of those elements, such as Israel will not withdraw from territory that it has occupied as a result of the recent incursion. Israel may continue operations under certain conditions in the south of Lebanon. Israel has blown up a bridge, the last bridge between two parts of Lebanon, the part that it had intended to occupy and the part to which it had expelled the population. In other words, it does not seem to be, from an Israeli point of view at least, a serious ceasefire as much as let's please Donald Trump and continue doing what we need to do. On the Lebanese side, clearly, on the part of the Lebanese government, there is some rejoicing because the Lebanese government, which has very few tools, at least it can come back to its population saying, we've delivered something.
Barbara, I want to read you, just before I ask you my question, some more on that reporting that we were getting from Ali Hashem, the statement from the Iranian Foreign Ministry about this ceasefire that is supposed to take place. In this statement, it also says that they are emphasizing the necessity of a complete withdrawal of the Zionist regime from the occupied areas in southern Lebanon. Now, we have also heard Benjamin Netanyahu say that he is not going to withdraw from southern Lebanon. So I wonder if you think this is going to be somewhere else that Iran tries to put pressure in these negotiations going forward with the U.S. to, and then maybe put pressure again on Israel.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be an impediment. Iran now has more control over Hezbollah than it did before the Israelis assassinated Hassan Nasrallah a couple of years ago. And if the Iranians tell Hezbollah not to send any more rockets into northern Israel, then it will be easier for the Israelis to observe some sort of ceasefire. This is, I think, a sideshow to the main event. So, no, I wouldn't be, I mean, the Israelis are not going to withdraw from the south of Lebanon in the foreseeable future. They are going to stay there for a while and continue their efforts to disarm Hezbollah however they can. But they will not bomb Beirut, and I think that's the most important thing that comes out of this ceasefire.
Well, you say, Barbara, that you don't believe that they will withdraw from southern Lebanon. I wonder, though, what that means for these hundreds of thousands of people who have been displaced at this point, who have been watching homes, businesses, bridges be destroyed. How difficult does this become for them to see a ceasefire but not be able to return home? And how much does that factor in on any pressure that the Lebanese government might be feeling regarding this ceasefire?
Well, we've seen the Israelis displace millions of people. Not just in Lebanon, but in Gaza and elsewhere. So again, I think it's important for the Lebanese government to have an agreement that is brokered by Donald Trump. It's important in terms of whether they can expect economic aid, other assistance. But there will be a lot of finessing going on to make this ceasefire look more important than it really is. It is a precondition for a larger agreement that the Trump administration wants to reach with Iran, and there are still many questions about whether that is attainable.
Hassan, do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that the success of one of these agreements hinges on the other, or not at this point?
Absolutely. If there is no agreement with Iran, Israel has free rein to do whatever it pleases. But for that matter, even if there is some sort of a framework agreement, clearly the Israeli government will do its best to ensure that there are enough gaps in the current ceasefire agreements that it pursues doing what it wants to do. And if the aim is really disarming Hezbollah, the approach that Israel has adopted since the previous cessation of hostilities agreement in November 2024 not only is counterproductive, but it was a recipe to reinforce Hezbollah. After that agreement, Israel continued bombarding Lebanon on a daily basis, of killing Hezbollah operatives or people who are remotely associated with Hezbollah on a daily basis, which basically strengthened the notion that that it's not a trustworthy partner and there cannot be really any confidence in any agreement that happens, which strengthens the position of Hezbollah and makes it difficult for the Lebanese government that is willing to accept any American framework to do so. And therefore, we are not currently, there is no path currently towards any possible agreement. And I'm not even referring to the fact that Israel has treated Lebanon over the past month and a few days, in the course of this phase of the war, as if it's open terrain. It's the Gaza formula. what it has established in Gaza, meaning impunity and destruction, and any Israeli concern is of more value than the lives of unknown numbers of Lebanese, or in the case of Gaza, clearly of Gazans. This formula does not work in Lebanon, which is fractured, meaning politically, because there is indeed two camps in Lebanon, two camps of unequal size, maybe depending on the situation,
Right.
but one camp that sees in Israel a permanent enemy, another that would like some sort of an arrangement.
So, Barbara, have we run into the same issue with the ceasefire that we've been hearing about in the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran, that there's just no trust between these two parties, and therefore finding a bridge to any sort of deal may be quite difficult?
Well, the problem is that Hezbollah is not a party to these negotiations. These negotiations were conducted between Israel and the government, in quotes, of Lebanon with U.S. mediation. There were no Hezbollahis in the room. At least with the U.S. and Iran, we have had now face-to-face high-level talks. President Trump is apparently now volunteering to fly to Islamabad himself if there's a prospect of a deal. He would love to have a photo op with Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament, I'm sure. You know, there is more of a direct basis. These are two countries, two states, two sovereign states, as opposed to Lebanon, where sovereignty is shared among numerous groups and has been, frankly, for decades.
Barbara Slavin, Distinguished Fellow at the Stimson Center and a specialist on U.S. foreign policy and Iran, and Hassan Menemne, political analyst and researcher at the Middle East Institute. Thank you both for being here. You're watching Al Jazeera. Here is a reminder of our top stories this hour. U.S. President Donald Trump says a ceasefire in Lebanon, which comes into effect in about 30 minutes' time, will include Hezbollah. Trump also said that Iran has agreed to hand over its store of enriched uranium, adding that the two sides were close to a peace deal, ending 6 weeks of conflict. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says American forces will begin combat operations against Iran if Tehran fails to agree to a deal. The warning comes as the U.S.-Iran ceasefire expires in less than a week. A second round of talks between the U.S. and Iran would very likely take place in Islamabad again. A Pakistani delegation is currently in Tehran to deliver messages from the United States. Let's get some more perspective on those developments. Joining us now from Tel Aviv is Alan Pincus. He is a former Israeli diplomat. Alan, thank you for sticking with us here on Al Jazeera. We appreciate it. I want to get your initial thoughts on the idea of this ceasefire that is supposed to come into effect in 30 minutes' time, and whether or not you think that it is going to be successful out the gate.
That's a very good question, because, you know, as human folly always dictates, an hour before a ceasefire goes into effect, both sides are trying to kill each other for whatever reasons. And that's exactly what's been happening in the last 2 hours. With Israel and Hezbollah exchanging missile and rocket volleys. Yeah, look, the ceasefire is going to go into effect, and it remains to be seen what exactly does it cover, both geographically and substantively. Because if there is a security buffer zone in the south of Lebanon, stretching from the Israeli-Lebanese border to the Litani River, and in that area and in those quadrants, Israel feels it has license to go after Hezbollah, and Hezbollah feels it could launch whatever rockets it still has in that area against Israel, then the entire ceasefire will collapse pretty soon. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, going back to your question, on the other hand, President Trump seems to be, or at least sounds, I know he can contradict himself in 1 hour, but right now he seems to be invested in this only because he realized that a ceasefire in Lebanon is the key, or the prerequisite rather, to a deal with Iran, which he wants very much. And so there is a chance that he's going to coerce Mr. Netanyahu into adhering to this ceasefire. But, you know, the reality on the ground could go either way.
I want to get your thoughts on one other thing, given that some of the criticism that has been coming in to Netanyahu is that this was maybe a premature ceasefire in terms of the mission that Israel was trying to accomplish in southern Lebanon. We know Iran asked for this ceasefire as part of negotiations. A spokesman for the Iranian Foreign Ministry has also said that they want to emphasize the necessity of the complete withdrawal of Israel from occupied areas in southern Lebanon. Do you think that there's a chance that there may be more pressure placed on Netanyahu here to make another move that he maybe is not ready to make?
Yeah, most definitely there's going to be pressure. And I don't think he has any leverage in terms of resisting that pressure. You know, there is evidence. There's plenty of evidence indicating that Trump is unhappy with the initial premises or initial ideas that Mr. Netanyahu put forth, swaying him into this war. I'm talking specifically about a presentation that he made to him on February 11th, 2 weeks before the war began, in which he more or less, not guaranteed, but said that the very high likelihood that Iran would capitulate after 2 or 3 days, that the regime will collapse, that there would be a popular uprising, that the Iranians would be too weak to attack the Arab Gulf states, Qatar, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and others. And most importantly, they would never dare shut down the Strait of Hormuz, not to mention the nuclear material and their missile capabilities. None of that, I emphasize, none of that happened. And there is evidence that Trump is disappointed in the best case, angry in the worst case. And so there's a good chance that he's going to pressure Netanyahu. And I don't see any way in the world, Riley, in which Netanyahu can push back against that pressure.
Briefly, Alan, if you could, and forgive me for asking what may be a naive question, but much has been made about how Netanyahu is going to sell this ceasefire. But isn't the prospect of peace with a neighbor a good enough sell?
No. You know, I mean, tragically, no. And it's not naive at all. It's a very good question because on the face of it, this should help. This should help him. But everyone understands that a peace with Lebanon is not a real peace unless Hezbollah is disarmed or Hezbollah ceases to be a military entity and goes back to being a political, social, religious group. That's not going to happen, at least not in the foreseeable future. There's going to be another set of negotiations now between Hezbollah and the government of Lebanon on the exact terms of whatever the ceasefire agreement or whatever the agreement after the ceasefire holds. And so Mr. Netanyahu is going to find it extraordinarily difficult to sell the idea that he won in Iran and that he won in Lebanon, because the general notion is that he lost on both. And no one understands, quite frankly, Riley, why he went into this war, given that in June of 2025, he stood there pumping his chest and flattering himself on how he, well, Trump used the word obliterate, but he obliterated, but he said, we set them back decades, referring to both Iran and Hezbollah. So I don't think politically this is going to be advantageous for him. How damaging it's going to be remains to be seen.
Alan Pincus, former Israeli diplomat, thank you for joining us here on Al Jazeera.
Thank you, Riley.
In other developments we're following, the U.S. naval blockade of Iran's ports is expected to hurt its economy. Most of Iran's trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz off of the southern coast, and Iran was already under severe sanctions before the war. Now, with maritime traffic blocked, it is looking at alternative ways to maintain trade with its partners. Ume Kulsum Sharif explains.
The U.S. military says its naval blockade of Iranian ports has completely stopped traffic to and from Iran. Earlier, Central Command said it's turned back several ships and that no ships had broken its blockade on Iranian ports since the operation began on Monday. Now, Iran has disputed that claim, and shipping data shows that some U.S.-sanctioned vessels have entered the Gulf despite the blockade. Now, Iran relies heavily on its southern coast and the ports here for most of its trade. About 90% of Iran's economy relies on international trade that arrives by sea. While most of the world economy was struggling last month, Iran has had a profitable March. And that's because it's continued to export its energy products using the Strait of Hormuz, while it severely restricted other countries from doing so since the start of the war. And its daily revenue, some reports say its daily revenues in March was close to $140 million, up from $115 million, while other nations producing oil and gas in the very region have been counting losses. Iran has begun to explore alternative shipping routes to bypass the US naval blockade. Analysts consider the Just port here a critical plan B. It extends from Gorek here and goes right down, bypassing the crucial Strait of Hormuz. The Chabahar port is another trade port on the Gulf of Oman that seems to be critical for trade connecting to Afghanistan and Central Asia. Now, it was developed by India, but a US sanctions waiver on the port is set to expire later this month. Iran is also exploring the northern ports along the Caspian Sea. Now, they are seen as vital trade hubs connecting to Central Asia and further up to Russia. Now, Iran shares its border with 7 countries, and it's connecting with its partners using land corridors to continue trade flows using road, rail, and sea routes.
Now let's take you to our London studio at Jonah Hull for more on the widespread global economic repercussions of the war.
Hello there and welcome to Al Jazeera's studio here in London, where we're charting the economic fallout of the Iran war and its impact on markets and global supply chains. Beginning with this, European markets opened slightly higher on Thursday, with investors apparently optimistic about a potential resolution to the Middle East conflict. The oil price is now at around $98 a barrel. The International Energy Agency has said this price doesn't yet fully reflect the impact of the war on global supplies. And on Thursday, it warned a shortage of jet fuel as a result of the ongoing closure of the Strait of Hormuz could see flight cancellations becoming a reality. Camille Nedelec reports now.
Filling up for takeoff from Nice Airport on the French Riviera. But as peak travel season approaches, officials say there may not be enough fuel to last the summer.
In Europe, we have maybe 6 weeks or so jet fuel left. If we are not able to open the Strait of Hormuz, if the refineries, as a result, will start to work, I can tell you soon we will hear the news that some of the flights from city A to city B might be cancelled as a result of lack of jet fuel.
Dutch airline KLM has already announced it's cancelling 160 flights in the coming month due to rising fuel costs. And other companies are warning of ticket price hikes. Around 75% of Europe's jet fuel comes from the Middle East, and its refineries don't have the capacity to scale up and fill that gap. It's part of a wider downbeat picture. The International Monetary Fund says the Iran war could trigger a global recession, with the UK set to be the hardest hit of all G7 economies. It's not yet clear how badly. Better than expected growth figures released on Thursday were recorded before the conflict began. But the whole continent will feel the impact. Eurozone inflation has risen to 2.6%, its highest level since last summer, pushed up by surging energy prices. And it's prompted leading economists to call for additional taxes on energy companies that will likely profit from the crisis. Camille Nedelec, Al Jazeera.
Well, with me in the studio to talk about all of this is Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economics and Business Research. Great to have you with us. And you were listing in there some of the economic effects continuing to spill out as a result of this war in Iran. Jet fuel shortages, we've heard much talk of that in recent days, the possibility of flight cancellations. And yet, for all of that, the markets seem calm, some say naively calm, even optimistic, ahead of the possibility of fresh peace talks.
Well, yes, I think they do believe that at some point there will be some resolution to all this. And we do also know that high prices, high oil prices and gas prices, high energy prices generally, do have, as a result, a reduction in demand. And that reduction in demand then eventually brings the prices down. Of course, we have a slightly different situation right now, which is a real supply problem, and that's likely to persist for a bit. But I think the markets have been reasonably happy with the fact that there has been this big release from the strategic oil reserves through the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and we've seen also a number of countries like Japan release even more. So they have been almost convinced that governments and the international institutions are going to come in and help.
Is there an idea that buys time for talks to go on?
It does. It buys time, but people are saying, really, we should be looking at middle of May. If by the middle of May the signs are that there has not been a real resolution, then I think panic will set in.
OK. Well, inflation is the watchword across many global economies, of course, and surging energy prices as a result of the war saw Eurozone inflation leap to 2.6% in March, revised up from an initial estimate of 2.5%. That's the highest since July last year and 2% above the European Central Bank target.
We take the International Monetary Fund's advice very seriously, both regarding the debt sustainability of European countries and developments in the capital markets, particularly with regard to government bonds. We can see the interest rates are rising slowly. We are also seeing this in Germany in the refinancing of our budget. We can see that the first rating agencies are beginning to issue a neutral outlook or a negative outlook without actually downgrading at the moment.
Well, Vicky, Chancellor Merz there talking about the IMF's latest warnings, among other things, talking about, well, the IMF warning about debt sustainability problems across the Eurozone, also warning about the UK and its particular vulnerability, said to be the most vulnerable amongst its G7 peers. A gloomy outlook there by the International Monetary Fund.
Well, absolutely. The IMF is worried about subsidies in particular. So it thinks that if countries start helping the consumers and businesses, but just supporting the price downwards, if you like, so that they can continue to operate in the level that they would like them to see continue to operate, then that's going to make the whole debt situation worse. And they are warning that there are limits to how much it can do. And the interesting thing is that the UK looks like it's in a worse position, even though it isn't really, because if you look at the debt to GDP ratio in the UK, it's lower than it is in the US, certainly lower than Japan, I mean, lower than Italy, lower than, well, almost than France, which is having more of a problem. And yet they seem to think that the UK, because it's starting, you mentioned inflation, really interesting to look at that. The increase in inflation in Europe, I wish the UK had that inflation. We're above that. And so we're starting with inflation which is higher than our competitors. And the US almost, we're about the same right now. But we're also starting from a situation where we have much higher interest rates, both short-term interest rates and, of course, our yields. Our bond yields are considerably higher than is the case elsewhere. And yes, the credit rating agencies are looking at all this again for Europe, but we are starting from a position where the costs of borrowing are so high, and if anything, costs will be rising rather than going down as had been anticipated. It's one of the reasons why we had growth. You mentioned how well the UK did in the last month, in February, that is, before the beginning of this latest war. That was because optimism had improved, expectation was that inflation would come down to below target, and also that interest rates will fall maybe 2 or 3 times in the year. That's all changed.
For it to be cruelly dashed by this war. Well, let's dig down a little deeper into the situation here in the UK, because official figures show that UK GDP expanded by 0.5% in February. That's stronger than expected and suggests the economy was gaining momentum before the onset of the Iran war. As Vicky was saying, there is still lingering concern about the impact of the war on the cost of living. And the government is also moving to protect supplies of carbon dioxide, a vital component in the food and agriculture industries, CO2. It's a byproduct of ammonia and fertilizer manufacturing, a process which requires a massive amount of gas, and the price of gas has, of course, surged since the Hormuz blockade began.
I made the decision 6 months ago, 1 week into this job, to mothball a plant in the northeast that has CO2 as its byproduct. I unmothballed that within a couple of days of the war in Iran starting, because I wanted to get CO2 there for resilience purposes. That plant is now up to full production, and people should rest assured that this means that we are watching very closely
With Hands of Hope Radio, we are here to proclaim breaking the silence is